Thanks for joining the Deer Labs at Mississippi State University and the University of Florida as we enjoy March Madness from the perspective of a deer nut. If you're able to produce the forages in our championship bracket in an adequate supply on your habitat, you're going to provide a remarkable year-round, high-quality, stable source of nutrition for your deer population. Today, we're going to talk about one of these categories, the vine forage category, which is important for that part of that stability, that year-round stable supply of forage. And it's particularly important here in the southeastern United States. Today's guest host is familiar to conservation organizations across the United States and especially to members of the National Deer Association. He's their Director of Conservation, Matt Ross. Matt, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Steve, Bronson, and Marcus. I'm excited about this opportunity. As soon as I heard you guys were doing it, I said, man, how do I get to be a part of that? And right after that, I heard that I was going to be in charge of the guest spot for the vine category. And then I thought, how did I draw the short straw? Now, in all seriousness, you're right, Steve. Although it doesn't drive the popularity of some of the other categories like browse or forbs. Vines are important, and I'm excited to be here with all of you to talk about them.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, I just want to point out that's one of the things that we were thinking about with this is that, we don't actually know what won yet. So we commonly sort of don't think about vines as being that high quality browse, but the deer might tell us different.
That's right, Matt. And in reality, all of our brackets, our regional brackets by category, it's a head-to-head situation. It's really, we've picked really important, valuable vines available to our deer populations. And today we're going to look at this head-to-head battle. So one of them is going to win. Here to break down today's vine bracket are Marcus Lashley and Scott Bronson Strickland.
Oh, that never gets old.
Evidently not. It never does.
It does make me a little bit nervous because I feel like I'm on ESPN occasionally when I look at you, Bronson. So, today we're going to talk about vines. And I think, this is a group that I'm excited about because I think exactly what y'all are just saying is true. Most people are probably overlooking these as an important part of deer nutrition and habitat for deer. And I'm not sure that I agree necessarily. So let's talk about some of these forages. Let's go to the first one here. So poison ivy, I think, is a perfect example. It kind of gets a bad rap. It has a black oil in it that can cause an allergic reaction on people. So if it gets on your skin, that's called urushiol. And I think for that reason, it's kind of assumed that it's just not a very good forage. However, I have seen this browsed pretty heavily in most contexts, actually. If it's particularly in the early part of the year during antler growth and lactation with females, when this plant is actively growing really rapidly, that elongating tissue that's super succulent, I see it browse pretty heavily then. And I think this might be one of those that kind of sneaks up on people because you just assume, but based on it having that secondary plant compound, that deer wouldn't want to eat it. But I think they might tell us otherwise. We're going to see what happens. But sort of a middle of the run, which most of the vines are, middle of the run in terms of the quality when you start looking at the metrics. But definitely one of those that I'm looking at closely here.
Poison ivy's kind of like ragweed. Deer run to it, but a lot of people run from it. Poison ivy, I guess also, I consider it middle of the road, but I may be playing this wrong because once you learn to identify it, and a lot of people, including, non-hunters, non-deer hunters, know how to identify poison ivy. But when you really develop a search image for it in the woods, the stuff is everywhere. And so although I see it browsed a lot, I don't see it just browsed as much as, I guess, some of the other vines we're gonna cover today. So without a doubt, it's important. I probably don't rank it as high as some of the others, but definitely an important vine for deer.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, this is one of the species that is intriguing. I wouldn't rank it super high in terms of out of the four that are here. I've definitely seen it browsed. It's an interesting plant. There's a couple of them in the list here that you can see as ground cover or vine. This one actually I've actually seen in a shrub form too, a small shrub. But I think what's interesting about it is usually the new growth, that stem that extends to the leaflets, usually is really supple. I think Marcus just said that, and it's typically consumed. So sometimes you won't see the leaves or the leaflet, but you can identify it from the vine and kind of the hairy appearance of the vine. But in terms of its importance to deer, it ranks high. It's ubiquitous. It's all across the whitetails range, but I don't think it doesn't get my top pick out of the choices here.
Let's look at the next one. So Trumpet Creeper, this is one that's definitely a favorite for some people because of the pretty flowers, and that nice tubular flower is really important for several wildlife species like the ruby-throated hummingbird, for instance. Don't typically look to this one as being our high quality, important, most selected deer browse. However, think back to when you're seeing this again in this time frame during the early summer. It's pretty common, and it's pretty commonly browsed when I see it. So this is another one that I'm thinking of, as one of those. It might be a sleeper.
Yeah, I've had to think really long and hard about this, and I'm a little bit biased because I know working at our deer research facility, it's very easy to grab a stem of Trumpet Creeper and take it in. If you want to coax a buck or a deer over to you, they always come running and they always eat it up. And it's also one of these forages where Steve and I have done some outreach in the past, and the video will show how much the deer are just climbing over themselves to get to Trumpet Creeper to eat it out of her hands. And sometimes we'll get feedback on, how do I plant that stuff? It looks so good. Luckily it's there, there's nothing you have to do. Disturbance will cause it to grow. So I'll be honest, this could be one of my picks here. This is one of my favorites.
I think the aromatic tendencies of this plant adds a lot to the value too. Thinking about the smell and how that offers and calls deer in. It's not as widespread. I have some experience seeing it browsed in my travels. Certainly I'm calling in today from not in the Southeast, but I know it's important to deer, and I know that this one might surprise us.
And this is a case where Trumpet Creeper is more of a sun-loving plant. Earlier, the poison ivy is a shade-tolerant plant. So, different forages can be part of a habitat under different circumstances across your property.
Yeah, so let's move on to Greenbriar. Based on the online activity with folks filling out their brackets and getting to see what people are choosing, this seems to be one of the fan favorites out of this category. And I think there's a really good reason for that. One, this plant is nearly ubiquitous, if not ubiquitous. There's some species of Smilex where you're at, most likely. And two, it's very common in the understory. And three, if you find it, it's going to be browsed almost always. So let's think about that for a minute. Some of we talked about the urushiol and the poison ivy. This one has a little bit different strategy. It actually has a mechanical defense with those thorns. And most people think of that the wrong way. In my experience, when I'm teaching people about plants, they think, oh man, it's got those thorns. It must not be good browse because it's defending itself. And it's actually the opposite. It wouldn't invest the energy into defending itself if it wasn't really tasty. And it's basically trying to ward off herbivory, at least at a level that wouldn't allow it to produce fruit. So that's kind of something that makes it really interesting to me. Another thing that's interesting about this plant is it has an enormous rhizome, which is basically an underground root system with buds on it. And when you nip it off, it starts shifting dominance to other buds, and you end up with this little knot of it in the woods. So if you've ever seen that, that's kind of what's going on. It has this enormous root system, and you're likely seeing what you think is many Greenbriar plants is all actually the same plant, which is kind of an interesting thing from a structural characteristic. But it also, this one is one that tends to carry really high nutritional value. And for that reason, I think it's a pretty obvious favorite. And it seems that way when looking at people's bracket when they're filling them out.
Well, I'm going to agree with the fans. It's a fan favorite. It's one of my favorites as well. And I give credit to all the people that have selected Greenbriar, because like me, every time they're out in the woods and they see Greenbriar, they see that it's been browsed. And Marcus, like you alluded to, the crude protein on the older tissue, it may be average, but some of that really new growth, I mean, it can be well over 20%. I think the only knock on Greenbriar from like a deer management perspective is you usually just don't see as much biomass of it. You know, that's just not the life history of the plant. I guess it's, you know, trying to ascend and to get into the canopy and escape browsing. But yeah, this is one of my favorites. I'm going to agree with the fans on this. This one may be my pick.
I did note that there's a couple plants in here that actually had thorns, and this was one. I know about the plant's history. I know about how often people cite it as a favorite, and then honestly, it ended up in my top 2. But there were a couple things about the plant that I thought, I wonder if that is going to be the choice. And I weighed nutritional information as part of that. It actually ended up, but at the end, I had to, in essence, flip a coin between this one and another. But I ended up going a different direction. I wouldn't be surprised if this ends up being the pick. But I started thinking, in terms of the sample and the deer giving their choice, if they're giving free choice to all of these, is this the one they're going to choose? And I ended up just kind of going with a hunch and thinking no. So we'll see if I make a mistake. But I did not end up picking Greenbriar, but I would not be surprised if it ends up being, because of the popularity, if it ends up being the choice.
Yeah. So another one, this is probably not the one that people think of as a browse plant, but certainly a very attractive plant during early season, during the fall, because of the fruit production. So a lot of people are used to seeing, at least in some parts of the deer range, muscadines. For this particular trial, we use summer grape, which is the one that I see in the woods that is heavily used whenever it is available. It's very rare that I see grape at any time of the year, the summer grape. When it has leaves on it, it doesn't have them long because they're going to eat the leaves off of it. So it doesn't even matter that it's the early summer in this context. I think that just enhances it. This one, I think, is a pretty clear favorite. And maybe a lot of people are thinking more about muscadine, which the foliage tends to be less browsed on. But in this case, with the summer grape, I'm expecting this one to be one of the deer's favorites.
It's one of those that may not rank up there in terms of the nutritional diagnostics, but it sure must taste good. It's found just about everywhere, and deer certainly seem to enjoy it, browse on it often. I have always considered it. I may be wrong. We'll see. I've considered it moderate. But I think it's a solid choice. Would not be surprised if it won.
Grape, and I think it's one of the species we're about to see, have pretty high fiber content, meaning the digestibility is lower compared to some of the other ones. I stayed away from this. I would not, what you're saying, Marcus, in terms of it always being chosen. I don't see that as often, especially in the Northeast and parts of the Mid-Atlantic. It is browsed. But I've always thought about grape and Virginia creeper, which we're going to be assessing here in a minute, as high in fiber, less total digestible nutrients in the plant. And although it's chosen, I always wonder what else is around that the deer are eating. If they're eating it heavily, do they have free choice of something that might be a little bit more attractive? So I did not pick Grape, and I do not think it's going to win. We'll see if I'm wrong, though.
Let's look at the next one. This one I think was another pretty obvious fan favorite, and I think it's for good reason. Another one that has thorns on it, and I've heard several biologists say that this is probably the most important genus to wildlife in general, and particularly in the Southeast. I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with that, but it certainly has a really high wildlife value just all around. Not only do I like blackberries, basically everything in the woods likes blackberries. And, that's for the fruit, but also for the foliage. There's no question when blackberry is available, it is going to be browsed heavily. I just rarely ever see it available and not browsed when there are deer around.
Yeah, this was one I really struggled with in terms of I had to think long and hard about blackberry. And one thing to me, I know when I'm working with landowners, oftentimes you'll be at the edge of a food plot, because the soil has been disturbed, there's sunlight, and you will see blackberry on the periphery of food plots and browsed very, very heavily. And sometimes landowners will say, why isn't my food plot very attractive? Why are deer, eating this blackberry or this briar? And the bottom line is because it tastes good to a deer, it is offering something to them that they want. So whether you see it in the woods, whether you see it adjacent to a food plot, deer are selecting it, and for good reason. So solid choice. Would not be surprised if this one won either.
I'm a fan favorite of blackberry. It provides cover in addition to food. But again, they're talking about some of the defense mechanisms. It's there, and it's kind of grown up with deer, if you want to think of it. They've evolved together. Big deer and other animals, including humans, key in on it because it's vitally important to the life stages of deer and other animals. It's also it really can fend off some non-natives if you're managing the land correctly, and you're trying to convert something. It can offer those lines of defense as well, not just against herbivory, but trying to change the landscape and the plant cover. Now, you'd think with my tone, I would pick this one as my choice, but I'm not. Given all of those accolades, it's still a plant that does not stack up against some of the digestible nutrients, attractiveness, and just, I think, palatability to deer. So I did not pick blackberry, but I'm a fan.
Well, to circle in before we move to the next one, I just want to remind people when we were collecting these forages, we were doing this with our hands, right? And when I say we, I mean the graduate students were doing this. But we were grabbing things that you could grab with your hands off of this plant and the other ones. And in terms of the palatability, those little soft succulent tips that are coming out, they may already have thorns on them, but they're not very fibrous yet. So that is what we were trying to grab the same things that deer did. And for this one, it was particularly important even to protect our own self by grabbing those succulent tips. But just wanted to remind the audience that, we were trying to select the same things that the deer would be eating out in the woods when we grabbed the forages. Let's go ahead and look at the next one. So Virginia Creeper, this one, it was during my PhD work, I think, when I really started getting an appreciation for Virginia Creeper. This one, sometimes it gets confused with poison ivy. This one typically has 5 leaflets, but not always. I have seen individual plants with 3 leaflets before, and I've also seen 5 leaflets before on poison ivy. So that's not a perfect distinguishing characteristic, but in terms of working with people that don't know their plants and I'm trying to teach them plants, that's what they normally get this confused with. But it's another one that's really widely available. It has some really interesting characteristics in terms of wildlife value. I see it used in different contexts, and there's stuff published on it. You don't find that much about it being really high-end deer forage. In fact, it's typically rated as low in some of the old literature on the subject. But in my experience, when I've actually measured diet selection, it can be highly sought after, particularly when it's in a landscape that's being burned. And you have a lot of succulent tissue responding from those fires. So for me, I think there's no question that this is an important forage, and it's widely available. Typically don't think of it as being that elite, highly selected forage most of the time, but I could certainly see it sneaking up on us.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Marcus. I think it's a very important forage. But if I were to see it utilized very heavily, I would think something is limiting in the landscape. You'll see this a lot, and especially in it's a shade tolerant. So in a closed canopy environment, you're going to see it. And I guess I've always thought of it as, I'm not going to say a rescue browse or something like that, but generally not as sought after as some of the other vines we have. So I don't think this is going to win, but you know what? We may always be surprised. Deer do crazy things.
That's why we're doing the trials, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen variations of different browse pressure on it, and this is more anecdotal than anything, and it might be regional, more in the north than the south. But I've seen it browse pretty heavily. It's an interior plant. Because it's shade tolerant, you'll find it in the woods or woodlands, but within like 50 to 100 yards away from an opening, browse heavier than somewhere in the middle of the forest. And I think that's an intriguing thing. It's almost like a staging plant. They're on their way to go eat somewhere else, and they're standing there and they're browsing it. This is another one of those that is a vine, but can also be a ground cover. And often I see when it's in a ground cover form is when it's browsed the heaviest. But I like Virginia Creeper. It's one of those kind of potato plants that's there. You don't really pay attention to. It can be confused with other species, but it's not something to try to manage for. But I think it is important to deer.
Yeah, good stuff. This is another one that at least gets a lot of traction online. I see people posting about this quite a bit. They're out fertilizing their honeysuckle. That's what I see really commonly. This one is actually not native. I think it's other than a couple of the food plots, the only one that we have that's not native. But it's such a
ubiquitous.
Yeah, ubiquitous and popular, I think is what I was trying to get. Is ubiquitous and popular to deer managers. I hear about the honeysuckle and I don't hear about people going and fertilizing other native plants very often. So that's one thing that I think led us to select this. People would have wondered, why do you not have honeysuckle in it? And I see this browsed commonly, no question about that. Where we collected the nutritional data on these plants, which was coinciding with the trials, it was actually fairly nutritious compared to some of the other vines, but I typically do not see it used heavily in most forest systems that are being managed well, at least. It certainly can have some value, though, but not something that I would be managing for like you were talking about, Matt.
Yeah, I agree, Marcus. I think it's really, really an important vine, but I don't think it's the most sought after. The nutritional quality of it's kind of middle of the road, so it's solid, and it is going to be utilized by a deer herd at some level. But again, just remembering we're kind of stacking these up head to head and letting the deer select. I don't think it's going to be a favorite of the deer. But out in the woods, they're certainly going to utilize it.
I will add to that, Bronson, most of the time when I'm seeing it browsed, it's during a different time of the year. Yeah. So that's something else to consider. Again, that this was early summer when we collected the foliage off of it.
Yeah, Marcus, kind of an interesting thought just occurred to me is our native honeysuckle is almost non-existent across the southeast where I've looked for it. Very rarely you can find native honeysuckle. You do find this Japanese honeysuckle that's photo in the photo here, is that, I guess to me, it suggests that the native honeysuckle was more attractive to deer, and the deer helped eliminate it, and the Japanese honeysuckle is relatively less attractive, and that's why there's so much of it. Does that make sense to an ecologist like yourself?
I think it makes sense. I'm not sure that there's strong data to support any sort of competitive, even indirectly through deer interaction there. It certainly is the non-native one is much more common. It's particularly Japanese honeysuckle. But I think even in places where there isn't the non-native honeysuckle, it's still pretty rare to see the native honeysuckles. I think they tend to just be a little less abundant on the landscape, particularly in higher deer densities. And some of that probably is because deer like to eat it.
Yeah, your mention about the timing was something I was thinking as well. Because it's got those semi-evergreen leaves, it does hold them longer. Or they also are one of the first ones to bud out and green out in the spring. And I think that's part of the timing that you see deer key in on it. And also the commentary. I think it's a confusing thing, although it's popular in the media about people talking about its importance or thought of importance. A lot of folks don't know that there was native versions or is, and that it is also in a bush form. The Lonicera species has a bush form of honeysuckle that is rampant in many states in the understory. But this is one of those subsistence plants in vine or shrub. I don't think it will rank super high. The deer are eating it because it's there, and it is out competing some other things that they want. I'd be shocked if this is chosen when given choice to all the other things we're talking about, but we'll see.
Yeah, sometimes we're shocked. All right, so this one may be a little less familiar for some of our followers that are outside of this region, but it's certainly really common in the Deep South. I have grown up with Alabama Supplejack and see it very commonly. Another one of those plants that is not necessarily the first one you think of when you think of high quality deer browse, but if you look through the old literature on diet studies and even on some of the stuff that I've been involved with over the years with graduate students, it does tend to rank high preference in those studies. And I think there's good reason for that. It's very common that when this is available, you see it browsed. I will add I like to talk about fire, so I'm going to talk about it again. When it's resprouting after fire, that's when I see it really getting used heavily, especially during the early summer.
I know when I came to Mississippi, this was not a vine I was that familiar with, but quickly working with our state agency biologists from the Mississippi Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Parks, they all really pointed towards this vine as being really, really important, attractive, an indicator species for deer density and so forth. So I have added to my list of plants I look for. And a lot of them have really twisted my arm that this was going to be a champion. I'm not going to say that was my pick, but I'm really starting to think that it could be.
I think the importance of the sampling that we're going to see here in a minute is these deer were born in the South. They must know this species, and I think it'll show up in the statistics. But Alabama Supplejack goes by some other names, although it's not ubiquitous like we've said about some of these other plants. It is important to deer where it grows. They key in on it, and everything I've either heard, read about, or seen in person is that it's an important plant. So I think this is a contender.
Well, folks, there you have it. Our experts have shared with you their keys to the game as far as these different species. They're all winning forages. Now you've heard everybody's kind of qualifying. Well, this isn't as good as Forbes. It's not as good as Browse. Yeah, we get that, but they are an important category of forage, and this is all about relative competition. And so we're really excited to see who's going to pick what, and then we're going to see what the deer picked. So, Bronson, you want to lead us off with your pick for today?
I certainly will. I went with, again, I had a lot of input outside of what I should pick. Alabama Supplejack was really, really tempting to me, but I went with Greenbriar. And just from my experience, again, over the years, every time I see this plant, it's like looking at the photograph on the right. You will always see it nipped on the end to some degree. And so that was my choice, Greenbriar.
Solid choice, Bronson. I think makes a lot of sense. This one was this was probably the most challenging bracket for me to decide on, and there were a few of them that really stuck out to me, and Greenbriar was one of those. And this one, it has that mechanical defense, but it also has that enormous rhizome, which allows it to resprout readily after fire. It allows it to withstand really heavy herbivory, and it makes sense that man has taken that strategy to support really intense herbivory. But I started thinking a little more deeply about it, and I decided, no, I'm not going to select that one. I think it's too obvious, right? It seems like it's the right choice, but I started thinking about the context again, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, you know what? I've got to pick one of those that's going to be a little bit surprising to others, I think, and I had to make my choice. It's poison ivy. So there are a couple of reasons. One, I was thinking about the context. This has the anti-herbivory compound that's specific to mammals, but deer co-evolved with it and have defenses that doesn't seem to bother them at all. And I've obviously seen it browsed pretty heavily in different contexts, especially that succulent tissue. Two, we made some graduate students go out there and collect that. So, I feel like the deer are really going to appreciate that because it's probably not available to them inside there. And three, that we think about anti-herbivory defenses as just being this negative evil thing. But I know, Bronson, you and I have talked about this quite a bit, that some of these plants have secondary plant compounds mixed within that can provide really important functions to animals when they're selecting it, and might drive some of the variations we see in diet selection, even with deer. And for me, I got this gut feeling. I got it about poison ivy, that's something that is not available to them, that they might need to mix into their diet. And when it's available, they're going to eat it. That's just the feeling I got. So I had to go with poison ivy.
Well, I took a different tactic. Instead of going with the gut feeling, I used the information that I had. Actually looked up a bunch of references on nutritional data and selectivity, on palatability, and I came down to a couple choices. But I kind of inferred this before, but I literally flipped a coin. In fact, my 6-year-old flipped a coin and helped me decide, and it was between Greenbriar and my choice, which was Alabama Supplejack. I went with that. It's not something that grows where I live, but everything was pointing to the direction of that. I didn't talk to anybody to ask their opinions, but just the evidence pointed me there. I think that both of those choices are good ones, but I believe in a sleeper, and I think the Alabama Supplejack might be it for this one. So we'll see.
Interesting choice.
Good pick.
Interesting choice, Matt. Now, I hear what you're saying with the Alabama Supplejack. In my brain, it makes sense. In my heart, I'm tired of Alabama football beating Mississippi State every dang year, and I just can't take it. I'm not going there.
With Alabama in the name.
Now, Marcus, you might have a different perspective from Florida, being from Florida. Maybe y'all beat them every once in a while. So I can't go to Alabama. Greenbriar is, I'm right there with you, Bronson. Every time I see it in the woods, it's browsed. I'm going to go with the seasonal timing of the browse being important in my decision. It's holding on to its leaves much longer into the year. And, it's not a true perennial, but its leaves are there. And I think a lot of that browse pressure happens in the fall and into the winter. And so that's kind of a carryover that I don't think our early summer sampling here, the deer are going to be quite as attracted to it. I like rubus. I'm attracted to it every time I'm in the woods. If it's June time frame and there's some blackberries actually ripe, I'm right there, taking a chance with the thorns. But I'm wondering if the deer are also there after the berries, and they're taking the leaves because they're also there for the berries. Might be the kind of a complementary thing. So I'm not going to rubus either. What I am going to go with is it kind of, I got to tell you a story, and Bronson picks on me because I've been around a long time, but this story goes back to my graduate student days when we were sampling deer, bucks and does, every month of the year in several different regions of the state of Mississippi. We were out there collecting deer, and guess who got to take the rumen samples? And one time in particular, I ended up with such a bad case of poison ivy after that, and from a July sampling interval, I had to go to the hospital and get steroid shots. It just hit me so bad that I can't begin to pronounce the oil that Marcus mentioned. What was that again, Marcus?
Urushiol.
Yes, that one. That taught me very strongly. I've never forgotten it. Deer really like poison ivy. So that's where I'm going today. And Marcus, we're either going to sink or swim together today. We're both chosen the poison ivy, and this has been a lot of fun. We've given our best shots. Now let's take a look and see what the deer are going to think about these options for us today.
Ooh,
Going for the Greenbriar.
No, that's poison ivy. I can tell. Greenbriar is actually the one down here on the bottom left, Bronson, that's farthest away from the deer.
See, they're both coming in for the Greenbriar. Look at this.
Wait, no, we can't be eating on the same one. What's going on here?
Uh-oh.
Oh, I'm not sure that
little competition.
Oh, yeah, that's a foul.
Yeah, personal foul. He knows better than that.
Yeah, that I'm not sure if that was charging or an and one, so we can think about that. But
that's right. Well, clearly, the one deer had position, and the other forced them out. So yeah. I think it's a charge, personally. But I've been bad about second guessing calls on the floor. Well, let's pull up that bracket again, and I wonder who wins.
Look at there.
Oh!
You can believe it.
I think we're swimming, Marcus.
Yeah.
There you go.
I wonder if the only two that picked poison ivy. Or we're the only two that selected that. And I didn't know your experience, from digging through the rumens and getting it. But this is one of those plants where, for some reason, it just kept sticking in the back of my head that I see it browsed really heavily, especially in that time frame. And I can't help but wonder if that's because of something nutritious about the urushiol or whatever. I'm not sure what is driving deer to eat it, but it's obviously fairly nutritious. And I see it browsed heavily, and it always sticks out in my head because I'm trying to avoid it at the same time. I actually have tasted this. Like I told y'all, I tasted all the forages that I've seen deer eat. It doesn't taste good at all, and I don't recommend it to anybody. But when I was young, I was around poison ivy all the time, and this is one of those where when you're exposed to the oil over time, your body sort of can develop a reaction to it. And that's definitely what happened with me, because now I get it if I'm around it. So, but I was happy to see that won, because I think it's a little bit of a shocker for a lot of people.
It's so much of a shocker. I keep going back to that personal foul. I think something messed up the selection, because Greenbriar should have won.
Yeah.
I'm not buying this.
The foul in the last minute, that shifted the odds.
I'm going to be the disgruntled fan right now that's going to blame it on the refs.
There you go.
My team should have won.
Well, Matt, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a lot of fun. We've got to talk about some important deer forages, and sorry your choice didn't win.
That's okay. If I had post-traumatic stress disorder from a poison ivy interaction, I may have chosen it too. But I'm good. I think the winner is the deer and the deer hunter in this. I think it's great. As I said at the beginning of the pre-filming, that you're providing a list of a lot of favorite species to deer, and any one of them can be important to deer, and it's the diversity of across all of the different categories is what's really important. So I think it's great. And I'd like to interview the bucks that got access to this, because I know there's some little personality things with deer and pens. I've worked in a research facility in grad school, and depending on what deer you put in the pen, they do different things. So I don't know. I might need to do some interviewing and just figure out what deer you guys picked to actually get access to those.
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right, man. One of the exciting things about this for me is that we have 32, and I could rationalize a reason to pick almost any of them.
Yep.
Well, I had fun. This was exciting.
Yeah, it's great. And Matt, you hit the really key important fact and thing to take home from all of our shows is that habitat diversity is, if you build it, they will come. And folks, don't feel bad if your bracket doesn't fill out quite the way the deer filled it out. You'll be in good company, because we're not we're sinking as often as we swim. But we look forward to you joining us for our next show as we continue our trip down the road to the final forage.